Well, welcome to the first session of the fifth annual University of Minnesota Extension Pollinator Webinar Series, and we are thrilled to have you here. So we have almost 1,700 people registered. That's a huge jump from the 300 that we had when we started this like 5 years ago. So it's been really incredible to watch this program grow, and then really that is all thanks to you, all of you, our very passionate community of pollinator supporters. So whether this is your first year joining us or your fifth year, we're really glad to have you. So I look forward to this series every year, and I am continually inspired by just everyone's energy and curiosity that this audience tends to bring year after year. So I hope you enjoy the program as much as I do. I also want to share something really exciting. So, thanks to the generosity of many of you, we have raised over $7,000 to support pollinator conservation outreach. This funding will help not only support this year's program, future years' versions of this program, as well as additional pollinator education throughout the year and throughout the state. I am honestly flabbergasted by this level of support. So I am so excited to share what we'll be able to do because of those donations. So stay tuned and truly thank you for supporting this work. So on to what we are doing today. Today's webinar kicks off the first session in our three-part series, and we're excited to welcome Heather Holm, who will be presenting on keystone plants and soft landings plantings for native bees. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce ourselves. So joining us today is Quincy Sadowski, Extension Educator in Stearns, Benton, Morrison, and Sherburne counties, Robin Trott, Extension Educator in Douglas County, and myself, Tara Young, Extension Educator in Hubbard County. So just a quick note before we dive in, today's presentation is being recorded. I want to say that loud and clear. It's being recorded, so you can go back and watch it anytime you want. I'll be emailing out the recording this Friday, so January 30th, along with all the resource links that Heather and all the other speakers share this week. And that email will include also a short evaluation to help us improve the series. So, as a heads up, if you complete the evaluation at the end of the series, you'll also be entered for a chance to win a Visa gift card like we've done in past years. So, I'll also share more details about that on Wednesday. So, just keep an eye out, stay tuned. So, also, some other housekeeping items that I like to just go over how we interact on a Zoom webinar format if you're unfamiliar or it's been a while. So, we have a lot of folks on live, and I would like everyone to feel comfortable using these Zoom functions. So, just a few things. So, if you have any questions for Heather, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll only be pulling questions from there. If you have any comments, experiences, like want to share any resources you have or with each other, feel free to use the chat. You can also upvote the questions in the Q&A section. So if someone asks something that you're really interested in, that helps me know which questions to prioritize. And also because we have a really enthusiastic group that has a lot of questions and comments, sometimes the chat might be a little distracting for those of you that just want to focus on Heather's presentation. So you can always uncheck the show chat preview if you go to the little arrow on the chat window. So in the past years, I'll also be sending out all the chat and the Q&A transcripts. So everyone's really helpful comments and tips, I'll be sending that out in the resource email, so you won't miss anything. Now, I am very happy to introduce Heather Holm as today's speaker, who will be discussing keystone plants and soft native plantings. Heather is a author, educator, and nationally recognized expert on native plants and pollinators. Her work focuses on helping people create landscapes that truly support native bees and other beneficial insects, and we're lucky to have her here today. So Heather, you can share your screen.
Awesome.
And I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Tara. Hi, everybody. Great to be here. Hope you are in a warm, cozy place for the next hour and a half for this webinar series. Thank you to Tara and others for the invitation to present as part of this annual pollinator series. Well, I don't know about you, but I've been thinking a lot about pollinators the last couple of days with our frigid temperatures, and really looking forward to spring and some of these amazing insect pollinators coming out of hibernation. As Tara mentioned, the title of my presentation today is from canopy to ground layer, and how to build soft landings with keystone plants for pollinators. So I'll be talking about what are keystone plants, how they support various pollinators, as well as caterpillars, so the larval form of butterflies and moths. So I'm going to be sort of bouncing back and forth between these two insect groups across the presentation, first talking about the relationship between native plants and bees and pollinators, as well as caterpillars, the concept of keystone plants, and then overlaying both of those concepts and insect groups into this idea of a soft landing planting. So stay tuned, I'll tell you more about what that is, and how as gardeners we could consider doing a soft landings like project within our home landscape, our local park, or other like space. So as Tara mentioned, my work focuses on the relationship between native plants and pollinators, specifically our native bees, as well as predatory wasps. And I think you all recognize that the collective quantity or diversity of native plants within an ecosystem helps to increase biodiversity and also the functionality of that ecosystem. So essentially, when you have this diverse layer or foundation of various types of native plants, it helps to build complex food webs. And when these systems are more diverse, they are more resilient to negative disturbances, and as well as the impacts from potential climate change. So even at the micro scale of a small garden project, we really want to be thinking about providing as much diversity as we can. And here is, of course, the simple triangle illustrating the different trophic levels of a food web. And these are essentially just these interconnections between the plants, the herbivores, the omnivores, and the carnivores that make up the food web. So these basically it's what eats what within an ecosystem. We have the decomposers that are breaking down various materials, and then we have an upward energy flow starting from the plants, followed by the herbivores, omnivores, and lastly, the carnivores. And as I just said, having this diversity of native plants as your foundational layer really starts to build complex ecosystems and food webs. And what we have learned through research by various experts, as well as other publications, is that many and most insects have some kind of specialist relationship with native plants. So even this was reinforced, in fact, when I was writing the book on wasps. Most predatory wasps, for example, have the females who are out hunting either some kind of insect or spider, have very specific prey that they are looking for. So a given wasp may only hunt a certain kind of beetle from a single beetle family. And across the insect world, whether it's a caterpillar feeding on a host plant, a bee collecting pollen resources, numerous specialist relationships exist between native plants and pollinators and other insect groups. So this is one reason why incorporating native plants into your garden can really help support various insects. And these insects, of course, have these specialist relationships from long coevolutionary relationships. So the insects are consuming, for example, a very narrow range of plants if they're a caterpillar. If they're a wasp, they're only hunting a certain kind of insect to feed their offspring. If they are a bee, they may be only collecting certain plant pollens, and that is the pollen or food source that they are providing for their larvae. And the first sort of insect group relationship that I'm going to talk about and how that relates to keystone plants is that, as I mentioned, butterfly and moth caterpillars, also called lepidopteran larvae, have most of them have specialist relationships with native plants. So the caterpillars can only consume certain kinds of plants across this broad array of plants that are offered in the plant world. And the plants that support the most caterpillar species have been called keystone plants. So not every plant is created equal. So we may have, for example, 3 to 4 different types of trees growing in a garden or yard, but maybe only one of those trees is really the workhorse or the powerhouse or the keystone plant that is the larval host plant for a significant number of butterfly and moth larvae. And research by Desiree Narango and Doug Tallamy and Kimberly Shropshire really sort of brought this message home. And they created this wonderful graphic. The artwork was designed by Elsa Cousins based on their research. And as the researchers said, these functional food webs are essential for the successful conservation of ecological communities. And they illustrated that these insects have these very specific co-evolved relationships with keystone plants. Now, this is where keystone plants or plants in general are not all created equal. And what they found through their research is that only 14% of tree genera across the US support 90% of the caterpillars, meaning 90% providing the host plant or the food source for these caterpillars. So that means a significant number of tree genera may be only supporting 1 to a handful of different caterpillar species or perhaps none, whereas 14% of the tree genera are really the primary food source for these caterpillars. So what does this mean regarding keystone plants? Well, keystone plants you can think of as being the primary hubs or nodes within an ecosystem. So much like if you consider Delta Airlines, their flight map, where they have hubs such as here in Minneapolis or Atlanta or Detroit, all of these numerous flights are going in and out of the airline hub. And those hubs could be similar to these keystone species. So these hubs are having many different interactions across an ecosystem or food web with multiple other organisms. Whereas an outlier airport, such as International Falls, that only has one flight out of a hub, has much fewer interactions with other airplanes coming in and out of that particular airport. So the keystone plants that are the sort of top across the US and including here in Minnesota include oaks, willows, cherries and plums in the genus Prunus, pine, the poplar and aspen, the populus, as well as maple. There are others, but those are sort of the top 5 that fall within that 14% of tree genera that are supporting 90% of the caterpillar species. So these are considered keystone plants. And the authors of this study stated that if you were to remove these keystone plants from an ecosystem, they often characterize these keystone plants as giant bird feeders, because there is this extremely important connection, as this illustration shows, the chickadee holding that caterpillar in its mouth. A chickadee needs anywhere from 900 to 1,600 caterpillars during the 2-week period that it's rearing more chickadees in a nest. So those adult chickadees are busy going out and searching for various caterpillars, feeding on keystone plants. And if we didn't have keystone plants within the landscape, they simply wouldn't find enough caterpillars to rear more chickadees. So essentially, removing keystone plants from an ecosystem, the authors state that the ecosystem would collapse. So a similar way that if you were to remove a keystone, which if you think of Roman architecture, a doorway or an archway, that stone in the top center of the archway is called the keystone. And if you pull that out, the arch would collapse. So very similar analogy. If we don't have these top keystone species, growing within our gardens, landscapes, and ecosystems. So here, let's take a look at some of these keystone tree genera, starting with oak. And oak, I think, across the US is one of the top three most top keystone tree genera. And they, across the US, support more than 940 species of caterpillars that feed on oak leaves. And I want to mention that this caterpillar feeding isn't necessarily visible to the naked eye. So a lot of these caterpillars are sort of reclusive. They remain hidden. They're not doing significant damage to the tree that's going to cause stress or harm to the tree. Secondly, the plum or the prunus and cherry genus. So one of my favorite spring blooming plants is wild plum, and it provides both a caterpillar host plant as a keystone plant, as well as really valuable pollen and nectar resources for many of our flower visiting insects, not just bees pictured here, but I often call it the armchair plant because you will see early emerging butterflies, flies, beetles, wasps, bees, this whole spectrum of insects visiting plum flowers in spring, offering the pollen and nectar resources. Third keystone tree is the pine. So the pine and oaks were basically the two dominant tree genera across the US prior to Euro-American settlement. And these are both tree genera that are highly fire adapted. And we, Native Americans, through cultural burning, as well as naturally lit fires, really maintained across the US a landscape that was fire dependent. So these trees have certain traits that help them withstand low intensity fires. So here's a wonderful example of a diverse planting under a white pine tree that Diane Stonner submitted to me as a soft landing planting, which we'll talk about soon. But we may not always think about planting a pine tree, of course, in a residential yard, but important to understand that they're significant host plants for caterpillars. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk about bees from the perspective of keystone plants. And you may be aware we have over 500 different native bee species alone here in Minnesota. And about 32% of those, as you can see from this map of the eastern US, or 165 species, are considered specialists. So native bees that are specialists are those that the female bee collects a very narrow range of pollen from certain native plants. And I'll talk about sort of the spectrum of specialization in the following slides. But as you can see, the percentage of specialists across the eastern US varies by state. We have done an excellent job here in Minnesota characterizing the bees that occur here, publishing a state checklist in 2023. That is not the case for all of the states here on this map. So as more and more researchers within given states do publish a state checklist, then those numbers will continue to be tweaked or altered based on those publications. And so pollen specialization. So I mentioned we have over 500 species here in Minnesota of native bees. 165 of those are considered some kind of pollen specialist, but the remaining, the majority, about 2/3 of them do not specialize on any given plant pollen. So these bees are called polylectic. You may often hear of them also called generalists, and that simply means that they are a native bee species that the females are collecting a wide range of different types of pollen. So take a look at this two-spotted bumblebee worker in my photo. You can see even on her pollen basket, she's got two different colored pollens on a single foraging trip. So a polylectic bee is a bee that is collecting pollen from more than 4 plant families. And this can include our social bees, such as the bumblebees, as well as many of our different solitary bees. But the types of plants that an individual bee may visit, even if they are polylectic and not specializing, will really be influenced on by a number of things. So it will be dependent upon when that specific bee is active during the growing season. Our solitary bees generally are active for 3 to 5 weeks. And so that is just one window of time across this growing season that an individual species may be active. So their flower preferences will be influenced by what is blooming during the period that they are active as adults. And secondly, the shape of the flower. So we have bees that come in all different sizes and tongue lengths. So you can imagine as flowers become more complex in shape, they start to limit the access to certain sized bees or perhaps bees with very short tongues who are unable to access the flower resources. And as I mentioned, the seasonal activity of a bee will influence the flowering plants that it may visit, their physical size, their tongue length, their strength. Are they able to pry open these really complexly shaped flowers? So all of these things will narrow down the flower preferences, even though a bee is considered polylectic and not a specialist. So let's take a look at some of these specialist categories. This is the most unusual one, the also called the eclectic oligolectic bees. It's a bit of a mouthful, but these bees are really unusual. We have maybe one or two species here in Minnesota that fall into this category. The one I have pictured on the slide does not occur in Minnesota, but it's a fun example. This bee occurs across the eastern US from Maine down to Florida. And it is the southern blueberry bee, which specializes on both the vaccinium, so pollens from the blueberry or sometimes cranberry, as well as redbud and lupin. So redbud and lupin belong to the pea family, Fabaceae, the vaccinium to the heath family or Ericaceae. So two entirely different plant families, which is really unusual for a specialist. Usually they're only specializing on plants within the same plant family. An oligolectic bee is one that most of the bee specialists fall within, and that is a bit more of a broader specialist. So they are bees that are collecting pollen from a few closely related plant genera. So here in Minnesota in autumn, we have a number of solitary native bees that specialize on collecting aster and goldenrod pollen. So asters and goldenrods are closely related, belong to the same plant family. So those bees are a little bit broader specialists, picking up pollen from a number of different closely related plant genera. We get even more narrow. This is an example of a narrow oligolectic bee, and this bee just specializes on collecting pollen from dogwood flowers in the genus Cornus. And we actually have 2 or 3 species here in Minnesota that are dogwood specialists. So those females need to be on the wing or active when dogwood flowers are blooming, because that is the sole pollen source that they're looking for to collect, to take back to their nest to feed their offspring. And then really extreme example of specialization would be a bee that just collects pollen from a single plant species. So here in Minnesota, we have this bee called the geranium mining bee that collects pollen from wild geranium. This bee also occurs in surrounding states where more than one dominant geranium species occurs, so it wouldn't fall into this monolectic category. It would be perhaps a narrow oligolectic. But here's an example of a regional difference. Here in Minnesota, this bee is just usually collecting pollen from a single plant species, so it would be considered monolectic. So these plants that the bees are specializing on, the ones that support the most bee species, are also called keystone plants. So we've got the concept of keystone plants that are serving up and providing a host plant for a significant number of caterpillars. Similarly, these keystone plant genera that provide pollen resources for a significant number of specialist bees are also called keystone plants. And this is a snapshot of some of the top plant genera in the central US, so from Minnesota south to Texas. So a few of these plant genera on this slide don't necessarily occur here, such as the verbacina, but the rest on the slide do. So just to give you an idea of some of the powerhouses, the goldenrods, the asters, the sunflowers, the gumweeds, for example, are real powerhouses providing pollen for a significant number of these pollen specialist bees. And if we look at these pollen specialist bee plant genera across different habitats or ecosystems, you can see that most of the plant genera tends to occur in what we call a grassland ecosystem. So our prairies, our oak savannas, perhaps our open oak woodlands would be providing the correct habitat or the ideal habitat for most of the plant genera. We do have some really unusual specialists of certain wetland plants, water lily, pickerel weed, for example, as well as open woodland, and a minority that really are specializing on those really early spring blooming plants within our forests, such as our big woods or maple basswood forests. Okay, so now as I said, I'm going to be switching back and forth. So now we're going back to this idea of keystone plants supporting a significant number of caterpillars. So the researchers that I mentioned, Doug Tallamy, Desiree Narango, Doug Tallamy in particular, because he does a lot of public outreach presentations, has been encouraging people to plant some of these keystone plant trees within their yards to provide these important larval host plants for numerous caterpillars. My friend Leslie Pilgrim, who lives here in the Twin Cities area and has a nonprofit called Neighborhood Greening, she said to me one day, Doug Tallamy keeps telling people to plant keystone trees. But what is happening to those caterpillars when they're ready to pupate? So take, for example, the caterpillar I have pictured here, the red spotted purple caterpillar. It's busy, it's a bird dropping mimic, as you can see. And it's busy consuming a black cherry leaf, so a plant in the Prunus genus, which is a keystone plant. Well, when this caterpillar is ready to pupate, it starts to web itself a nice little overwintering shelter in a rolled leaf. And that leaf likely drops to the ground under the tree. So my friend Leslie said, we need to be thinking about this from a standpoint of supporting these caterpillars in all of their life cycle stages, not just in the larval stage. So she came up with this idea, which I'll talk about on the next slide, of planting that would go under these keystone trees. And you can giggle and laugh at my silly illustration here, but not all caterpillars that are feeding on these keystone trees are going to repel or climb or make their way off the host plant. Some do actually pupate attached to the host plant and don't actually go to the ground or try and disperse. But as you know, even the monarch butterfly caterpillar, after consuming milkweed, tends to disperse a significant distance from its host plant before preparing to pupate. So my friend Leslie said we have all of these scenarios in landscapes where we may have a keystone tree growing in a residential yard, for example, but we don't have the habitat required for these caterpillars to pupate safely under these keystone trees. So she came up with the idea of this concept called soft landings. And it's essentially that it's a landing place for those caterpillar species that do disperse from the host plant, whether it's by webbing themselves in a curled leaf or crawling to the ground to bury themselves into the soil near the host plant. And so the idea is that these soft landing plantings under trees can provide the critical habitat for these caterpillars to pupate, and at the same time provide a diversity of flowering plants that support pollinators that are looking for pollen and nectar resources, safe habitat for other beneficial insects that need to perhaps overwinter in dense plantings or under leaf litter, or also in the soil that's a place that's undisturbed. So this is a really nice example of a soft landings concept that Lane Harrison-Noke provided this photo for me. He is a horticultural ecologist at the University of Illinois, and they've been converting these underutilized turf grass spaces on their campus into soft landings like plantings. In soft landings, as I mentioned, you can now fold in these really important pollinator plants, including ones that provide pollen resources for some of our pollen specialist bees. You can provide refuge for lacewings and ladybird beetles and soldier beetles and all of these other secondary insects that we consider beneficial because they're providing some kind of ecosystem service that we benefit from. So, for example, ladybirds are often called ladybird beetles or ladybugs. We have numerous species here in Minnesota. Some are in decline or quite rare. But both the adults are predatory, as well as their alligator-like larvae are also predatory, consuming a significant number of soft-bodied insects that can cause damage to plants. And as you can see, the adults overwinter under leaf litter or similar places offering protection. So a soft landings planting may be an ideal place for this beneficial insect to spend the winter. Similarly, soldier beetles, these are also beneficial insects. The adults are very common, visiting flowering plants late in the summer, doing a little bit of pollination. But the larvae are really what is the part of the insect that is providing the most ecosystem service. They also are voracious predators of various insect eggs, including stink bugs, harlequin bugs, aphids, cucumber beetles. So if you have a diverse planting attracting these adult insects, the beetles, perhaps near your vegetable garden, their larvae are going to be providing some ecosystem services and pest population control to some of your veggie garden pests. Another beneficial insect that is really reliant on overwintering in leaf litter or in the soil is this group of insects called flower flies or hover flies, or syrphid flies, many common names. This one subfamily, most of them are mimics of some kind of bee or wasp. The adults are regular flower visitors consuming pollen and nectar. And while they're in your garden consuming those pollen and nectar resources, the females are looking for plants to lay their egg on because their larvae are predatory. They look caterpillar-like, but as you can see, they also are voracious predators of various small soft-bodied pest insect populations. So a soft landing planting can provide this refuge for not just for the caterpillars coming off the tree, not just for the pollinators, but these other beneficial insects that need this habitat to spend some part of their life cycle. So as you can see from these examples that Lane sent, we envisioned when we came up with this idea of soft landing plantings that these would be plantings that included plants that are pretty low in stature so that they were more aesthetically pleasing to look at. They kind of mimicked a low ground cover like look. You can imagine if we started to plant 6-foot tall unruly plants under a tree, then that planting will start to look less purposeful. So because of the varying light levels underneath a tree, depending on the tree's age, we are following the lead of some of the landscape designers who are primarily using a large matrix of either cool season sedges or cool season grasses, and then interplanting flowering perennials throughout the soft landings planting. So what are sedges? Well, sedges, most of the sedges belong to the genus Carex. We have a significant number of species here in Minnesota. Many are wetland edge plants, so they like really moist or wet habitats, but we also have a smaller subset of sedges that are tolerant of drier upland conditions. And these native sedges grow in our open woodlands, our savannas. And what's really great about them is they are cool season plants. And cool season plants do all of their flowering and a lot of their photosynthesizing when the temperatures are cool. So that includes the shoulder seasons, the spring, as well as the fall. So these give you a nice, fresh green look as soon as the snow melts. As you can see, the flowers can be quite attractive. I'll just show you a few examples of sedges and then follow up with a list of additional sedges that you can look for sale from many of our native plant growers. Pennsylvania sedge is a standard for a lot of these plantings. It's a soft, low-growing, slowly spreading sedge, so it forms a wonderful matrix through a planting. We also have clump-forming sedges such as these, the eastern star sedge, or the springles are often sometimes called the longbeak sedge. So as you can see, they're sort of like a ornamental grass alternative, but the added bonus is you get a lot of interest in early spring with them being immediately green after snow melt, and those early spring resources, the flowers rather, that do provide some pollen resources for certain kinds of insects. Most of our native plant nurseries are growing some of these sedges that are being heavily utilized in these plantings. So I've just got a short list here, and I know this is being recorded, so you can refer to it later. And many of our native plant growers are growing these sedges in deep self packs, and I highly recommend, if you want to try incorporating sedges into your garden, that you buy a good quantity of them, and you get them at a really great price because they are sold in these cell packs rather than individual pots. The same concept applies for those spaces under a more mature tree that is relatively shady throughout the day. You can also consider cool season grasses. And those are grasses just like sedges that are doing most of their growth and photosynthesizing in the cooler parts of the year, the spring and fall. But they tend to be, most of them that we would recommend tend to be a little bit taller than the sedges. The bottlebrush grass, for example, can grow up to 4 feet in height. So that might be something that you could use as an accent plant in a soft landings planting, but you don't necessarily want that to be your primary matrix plant through the planting. Okay, so you establish this matrix of various sedges that are adapted to the conditions under your tree. And then you want to consider adding a variety of different flowering plants interspersed within that sedge matrix. And that can include thinking about that continuous succession of flowering plants through the growing season, which is really important for supporting a wide variety of pollinators, starting with those really early ephemeral bloomers, such as Dutchman's breeches. That those flowers provide some of the first nectar resources for some of our early emerging bumblebee species. We have a variety of different violets to choose from that grow sometimes naturally in yards, but you can also find some for sale. And they are important pollen and nectar resources for bees as well. Early blooming bloodroot is another nice one to fold into a soft landings planting. Those flowers are nectarless, so they're just offering pollen resources to some of our very first or early emerging native bee species. Jacob's ladder is an example of a plant that also supports one of our rare pollen specialists here in Minnesota. So we have one bee that specializes on Jacob's ladder pollen. And the geranium specialist that I talked about earlier, wild geranium is a staple in my yard, which is primarily partial shade. And it does well in a variety of conditions, both dry, moist, even into almost full sun situations. So it's a highly adaptable native plant that we have. Easy to find for sale as well. Virginia waterleaf is another plant that has one specific pollen specialist bee, this little tiny mining bee pictured here. And it's also a really important nectar source for other early emerging bumblebees. So for example, I've seen queen rusty patch bumblebees utilizing Virginia waterleaf nectar. So really important, if you know you have rusty patch populations near where you live, you can consider incorporating some of these early blooming plants such as Virginia waterleaf. Then your soft landings plantings, you could consider a variety of different ferns. This photo was submitted by Vicki Bonk of her boulevard and soft landing planting. She's got maidenhair fern in the foreground, which has a beautiful texture. And then in the background, I think those are lady ferns that she has incorporated closer to the tree. The nice thing about ferns is they tend to unfurl or emerge a little bit later. So I like to interplant ferns with some of those flowering plants that are truly ephemeral. So the Dutchman's breeches or the Virginia bluebells, for example, that bloom and then completely die back to the ground within a month after flowering. So you want something to fill that void and also provide a variety of different foliage textures. Large flowered bellwort is another nice plant that provides pollen and nectar resources to a variety of different bees. The two-spotted bumblebee queens really like the large flowered bellwort pollen. And we also have a fairly rare specialist of the bellwort, a type of mining bee. And as I mentioned, the Virginia bluebells, a flower that has a more complex structure, that you can see that long flower corolla, very attractive to bumblebees, but that plant does go completely dormant. So you need some other plants to start filling in that void where that plant occurred prior to going dormant. We also have some pollen specialists of our forests here in Minnesota. These are two examples. Both I photographed at Nerstrand Big Woods in State Park. So we have a trout lily specialist on the left, as well as a spring beauty specialist on the right. Just love that pink spring beauty pollen. It's so cool. That's not to say that you still have an opportunity to support one or both of these specialists in your home garden if you live close to habitat where these specialists occur. Wild blue fox is another sort of stoloniferous plant that will weave through your sedge matrix. That plant is primarily visited by our long-tongued butterflies and moths, including that tiger swallowtail butterfly. I have rarely, or if ever, seen any native bees trying to access the resources from wild blue fox, just simply because that flower structure, the tube, is so long that the native bees can't seem to get their tongue down to feed on the nectaries. False Solomon seal, another great plant for a partially shaded, somewhat dry landscape, such as a soft landings planting. Here's another photo that a gardener submitted to us. So after we launched this soft landings educational campaign, we encouraged people to send their photos of their soft landing plantings. Michelle, I believe, lives in the mid-Atlantic region, so not in Minnesota, but you can see she's taken a little bit different tact. She's got nice low-growing plants, including violets, foam flower, wild or eastern columbine. She did not, it appears she didn't add any sedges or grasses, but I think she achieved the same aesthetic and habitat by just using flowering plants in her example. Other pollen specialist plants include golden Alexander, and this plant is also quite versatile. It's considered a oak savanna plant in our natural habitat, so it's tolerant of both full sun as well as partial sun. It does get a little bit taller and tends to reseed, so make sure you remember that if you do try and incorporate golden Alexanders into your soft landings planting. I forgot to mention I'm kind of moving with these plants from early spring through summer and then into autumn to illustrate the continuous succession of flowering plants. So these are ones that bloom midsummer, and that can be a challenge for any shady gardening situation, is to find flowering plants that bloom midsummer. Poke milkweed is one of our native milkweeds that we have here in Minnesota that is oak woodland or oak savanna milkweed. So it's very tolerant of partial shade conditions. It's one of my favorite milkweeds. And it still is a larval host plant for the monarch butterfly, of course. One of the plants that I've been incorporating more in my garden in the last couple of years is this wood mint, hairy wood mint. We have one species in Minnesota, and that's the Blophelia hirsuta. There is a second species that some native plant growers will sell, which is tolerant of more sunny conditions. But what I like, because I live in the suburbs, I have heavy deer populations, heavy deer browsing. This, because it's in the mint family, doesn't get browsed by deer. So it provides the flowering resources middle of the summer, and it withstands the assault of all the browsing deer that I have in my suburban yard. Okay, transitioning into fall, the goldenrods and asters are really the powerhouses that bookend the growing season. So not only are they keystone plants as far as providing those pollen resources for a significant number of native bee species, they are also keystone plants as larval host plants for caterpillars. So they are a double whammy, so to speak. And we have several goldenrod species that are native here to Minnesota. Not all of them, or very few of them, are what we consider more shade tolerant. The top one that I would recommend is the zigzag goldenrod pictured here. It's a slowly spreading goldenrod that gets anywhere from 12 to 18 inches in height. So it would be a wonderful addition to a soft landings planting. I find the goldenrod specialists frequently on the zigzag goldenrod in partial shaded conditions. That bee pictured here is in the genus Protandrina, and she is a specialist of goldenrods and asters. So some of the goldenrods that I really like for a soft landings planting include the elm leaf goldenrod. That one is a little bit harder to find. Only some native plant nurseries have it for sale. It is historically a open oak woodland and oak savanna goldenrod in Minnesota. And the second one, blue stem goldenrod, a similar form, sort of airy flowers. It is not native to Minnesota, but I think it's very appropriate for a home garden. And it's called blue stem because the stems have this light blue hue. So both are relatively tolerant of shade. And I could spend another hour showing you all the specialists of goldenrods, but here are a few. Some of my favorites. On the left is the hairy banded mining bee. I think one of the sweetest looking bees that we have in Minnesota. So she specializes on goldenrod and aster pollen. Similarly, this spine-shouldered cellophane bee on the right is also a specialist of goldenrods and asters. So lastly, the asters. The asters are just as important, and like the goldenrods, are the double whammy, keystone plants for caterpillars, as well as the pollen host plants for native bees. We have, again, many species of asters native to Minnesota, but not all of them are shade tolerant. These are some that I would recommend. My top one would be this large-leaved aster, which is a spreading aster, very tolerant of shade. I have a pretty large population of this under the large white oak tree in my garden, and it's been there and thrived. And this aster tends not to get browsed by deer or at rabbits for that matter, like some of the other asters. We also have some neat asters such as crooked stem aster. I have several of these in my garden, tolerant of partial shade, as well as the smooth blue aster I find can tolerate quite a bit of shade as well. And just like the goldenrods, we have tons of different bee specialists of aster flowers. So it's fun to get out in early autumn, late summer, just to see the bee diversity on these two different plant genera. So I encourage you to get out your cell phone or your whatever kind of camera you have and start capturing some of these really neat looking bees. Okay, so some concepts for the planting itself. As I mentioned, many of our native plant growers sell plants in small plug format, which I highly recommend buying, especially if you're planting under a mature tree. You really need to be careful about protecting the health of your tree. You don't want to be out there with a long-handled shovel digging 1 or 2 gallon sized hole into the tree root system because that could impact the health of the tree. So gently digging these smaller holes and incorporating these plugs throughout your soft landings planting is going to ensure that the tree won't be negatively impacted by the planting process. You want to remember to plant densely too, because you want these plants to fill in fairly quickly. So that old sort of gardening notion that we buy these 1 gallon containers, plant them 24 inches on center and mulch in between. We want to get away from that because we're selecting these plants that are naturally going to weave and form the matrix and spread and close in those gaps, reducing your overall weed pressure. There are a number of ways to prep a site converting turf grass if you were to do a soft landings planting. I am a big proponent, especially if you're doing conversion under a tree, of not using herbicides because spraying herbicides on turf grass under a tree could negatively impact the tree. So there are pros and cons to each approach. But for this scenario, I recommend sheet mulching. And sheet mulching is simply using several layers of smothering material to kill the vegetation before planting. So here, for example, I like to do the garden prep in the fall where I have excess leaf litter. I will often rake excess leaves onto the turf grass before I then put a layer of paper and then weight it down with mulch. Now we have a whole new problem with mulch, as many of you know, because we've had European earthworms here for a long time, but now we have the jumping worm. And the researchers from the University of Minnesota, Lee Frelich, have shown that if you buy bagged mulch, which is not ideal because of the plastic waste, but if you're getting bulk mulch, you're increasing your risk of bringing in jumping worms into your yard. So buying bag mulch, and their research found if you put those bags out in the sun on your driveway for a few days, the bag heats up enough and it will kill any jumping worms. So that's a safe way to use a one-time layer of mulch in order to successfully smother the plants. The paper, you can buy these various thicknesses of paper in paint stores and home improvement stores, and that makes it really easy because they're 3 feet wide and 100 or 50 feet long. You just roll it out, you overlap it, you cut the borders with a box cutter, and it's much easier than trying to use newspaper or cardboard, in my opinion. So in summary, soft landings under Keystone trees are going to support various stages of beneficial insects, whether they're overwintering as pupa, larvae, adults in leaf litter, in the soil, in the dense planting. It's going to help build healthy soil under your tree, provide significant amount of food for songbirds if you have a keystone tree species in your yard. Hopefully sequester more carbon than your turf grass, which I believe it would. And then it's going to reduce your time mowing. So everybody loves to have more time to do other things than mowing, I think. Tara is going to send you a number of different links. And so we developed a soft landings planting plant list. So you'll get those links after the webinar, as well as a story map. And you can check out, we have more detailed information on my website about things to consider for your soft landings plantings. And I'll just end by letting you know about my new project. This is a new nonprofit project, a free public resource that I and researchers from the U and the DNR have developed. It's a state website that is characterizing all of our 500 plus bee species that we have here in Minnesota. So please check it out. It's still, it will always be under development as we continue to add to the guide, but it includes lots of information about plants, specific information at the species level for many different bees, all about bees section, so you can learn more about the host plants in Minnesota for these pollen specialists. So I hope you find that a valuable resource, and it will always remain free and accessible to the public. So thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Heather. That is a great way to start off the week. I know I'll be going back and watching the recording for maybe a couple of times because I don't know if I fully absorbed everything, probably just like everyone else. So thank you so much. I really appreciated how you did like a whole ecosystem view of pollinators. And I mean, as a plant person, I appreciate that as well, but how you brought in the chickadees and how we're looking at it ecological perspective. So
Yeah.
really, really well done. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
We
you're
ha
welcome. I think
have,
that's the best thing about this idea is that it's a way to communicate that you can to your neighbors or whoever, right? That you've created this little mini ecosystem and the connectivity of everything.
yeah, it kind of makes us feel very small as well. And
Yeah,
when we think
exactly.
about it that way. Yeah. But big impact. Yeah. Oh, cool. So we have lots of questions coming in for you. And I think one of the best ones to start with, Douglas started off right at the beginning. He said, what initially attracted you to the specialty of pollinators and soft landings?
Oh wow. Well, I kind of fell down the we call it the pollinator rabbit hole almost 20 years ago, and that was just through working in native landscapes and really doing a lot of in-depth observation and noticing patterns of visitation to, these same bee species, for example, would keep coming back to the same plant year after year, and I had more questions than answers. So I think that's when I really fell down the pollinator rabbit hole and connected with the university and helped with some research and joined a study group um, I'm continually fascinated by the topic because there's always so much to learn. And every day during the growing season, I feel like I can walk out the front door and discover something new. And that is the case for everybody listening to the webinar. I think there's so much we don't know about the basic natural history of many of these pollinating insects that we have here in Minnesota. So encourage everybody to just, really have fun with that exploration and observation.
Awesome. I think you're in good company here. I think a lot of people feel the same way. So I appreciate it. So looking kind of backwards is big thinking, evolutionarily speaking, what is the advantage to a plant or a bee to be a specialist?
Well, you wouldn't think very much, right? So I guess from the plant's perspective, if they are relying on insect pollination, then it could be an advantage if they have a dedicated bee that is only visiting them for the pollen resources, right? So it's going to increase the likelihood that the flowering plant may get pollinated because it's got a dedicated pollinator. Um, if we sort of flip that over and look at it from the bee's perspective, the advantage to the bee, you can liken it to taking out a lot of the guesswork, right? If those pollen host plants are available in abundance near where that bee is nesting, then it really makes the bee's life easier and improves their energy expenditure because they're just going to that specific patch of flowers of the host plant. But on the flip side, it's also a pretty precarious situation, which is why many of us are concerned about these specialists because with climate change, there's a real likelihood that some of those host plants are going to be blooming earlier than historically average, and maybe the bees themselves are using different phenological cues. So there's may become this real mismatch between when their host plants are blooming and when the bees are actually active. So that's a concern, and that would be, I would say, a significant disadvantage for them.
Mhm. Pros and cons all the time. Um, do bees know which plants they can and can't utilize? Would they try to get pollen from a plant that's not in their specialty, or what would happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, researchers have conducted a number of studies sort of looking at what happens if we try to rear bee larvae by feeding them non-host pollen. And one really interesting paper found that the female bees, so the females were sort of captured in a lab scenario where they were provided certain flowering plants, but not the host plant. And they just decided, no, I'm not going to continue nesting because the resources that I need aren't there. So they ceased nesting activities. But then on the flip side, they the researchers were able to successfully feed the male larvae, bee larvae, non-host plant pollen, and they grew and developed into adults, whereas the females did not. And so that's even more bizarre because it showcases even by the gender or whether they're male or female, the likelihood that non-host pollens can mean the success of a population. The other really interesting thing that's not fully understood is how specialist bees find their host plants. So as far as the bee life cycle goes, a bee larvae develops in a nest, and when it emerges as an adult, right, it's never been out in the world. It's never interacted with its parent if it's a solitary bee. So how in the world does that female bee know to go to a specific host plant to find that pollen? And most theories think that they imprint on the smell of the pollen as larvae. So it's the floral odors, the pollen scents that they're imprinting on, and then they're using all of the olfactory means when they emerge as an adult to find that host plant. But that's just one prevailing theory. So I find that also fascinating, yeah.
And that's why you can never stop learning because it's always different.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. That was kind of going along with this question that was upvoted a while. So it was, will native bees gather the pollen of a non-native plant? So it depends, is what.
Yeah, it's pretty rare. I mean, so the some of the pollen specialists, they will, male or female, you'll find them visiting other flowering plants to feed on nectar. So that can confuse people if they're observing and then they realize, hey, that was a specialist. What was it doing on this plant, not the host plant? And it was likely they were just getting nectar resources from a non-host plant. So, for example, I've seen squash bees, which specialize on, the cucurbitas. I've seen females out visiting wild bergamot, feeding on that plant's nectar. And I was very confused when I was like, what is that bee? Because I thought, at first I thought, this is a new bee species I've never seen before. And then I realized, no, it's a squash bee. And then I said to myself, what is it doing on wild bergamot? So yeah, that's not uncommon.
They do what it takes to survive.
Yep.
So kind of going along with all of this, and you kind of alluded to it, how do researchers determine all of these specific relationships between the bee and the plant?
Yeah, so it really started with this gentleman named Charles Robertson back in Carlinville, Illinois. He went out every day in the early 1900s and just thoroughly documented plant pollinator interactions. And he was one of the first to kind of come up with this idea that there is specialization of pollen host plants in the bee world. And then researchers since then have conducted various kinds of studies to sort of reinforce or prove that that is the case, that these bees do specialize on specific plant pollens. So a lot is still unknown. Those categories that I showcased in the presentation, those are pretty strict and narrow categories, which some bee researchers don't like to adhere to because so much is still unknown about the pollen specializations. But
Sure.
yeah.
So kind of switching gears into a little bit more specifics about all these different components that you had talked about. So specifically a bee lawn, do you think that equates to a soft landing, one with clover, fine fescue, and short growing perennial flowers?
Not necessarily. I mean, the difference in the soft landing is you're getting more diversity in actual plant structure, like a little bit taller plants and a variety, denser planting. And it's that structure that's naturally going to capture leaf litter and provide some of those insulating layers that these beneficial insects need to maybe overwinter underneath the leaf litter or in that dense vegetation. So I would say there's a significant difference in the structure as well as the plant composition. So soft landings, the idea is to have primarily native plants under the tree to provide those diverse pollen and nectar resources versus beelands that are, pretty low diversity systems that are more geared for more open mode habitat, right?
A great clarification. Thank
Yeah.
you. There was one and it just moved. There's a lot of questions, about trees. So how wide of a diameter around the tree does the soft landing need to be effective? And then does that diameter expand as the trees grows?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I've got a 200-year-old white oak under my in my yard. I wouldn't necessarily want to start with we generally we're saying drip line, which is the outer extent of the branches underneath that. But if you have a 200-year-old oak in your yard like I do, that's a big planting to start with. So there's no hard and fast rules. You can start with a smaller planting closer to the trunk, expand it over time if it's a large tree. Or on the flip side, if you just plant a young oak tree, for example, you can create a soft landing underneath it and expand it as the tree grows. And that original or new soft landing planting under a young oak may be full sun, right? So you're going to have to sort of customize and tailor it to the light levels as the tree itself matures and provides shade.
More tree questions. So about pines and just kind of the expansion as more folks start to plant pines in other parts of Minnesota and even other parts of the country.
Yeah.
Has the native insect population also expanded with them? And are we strictly talking about pines or other evergreens like spruce?
Yeah, I don't know about specific examples of range expansion of pine specialists. Uh, there are certainly a ton of examples of range expansion for other pollinating insects. We have, just last year, two new bee genera were discovered in Minnesota due to a likely range expansion of them coming from their southerly range and pushing into our state. So I think with climate change, we're going to continue to see range expansion in that sense, but I don't have a specific answer as far as pines. And that person asking the question may be thinking more broadly of the planting of various evergreens, as you mentioned, Tara, including like spruce and so on. So
And it was one other question was, can you do a soft landing underneath a pine or a spruce tree? I would feel like that would limit a lot of the species that you could grow, but
yeah, you certainly could under a pine. I had that example of the planting under the white pine. Spruce are tricky because the branches are so low, right? So you simply just don't have enough room or light levels to do a successful soft landings under there. And and you don't necessarily want to limb up your spruce tree either. So
yeah, exactly.
yeah. So I would focus on a keystone tree if you do have it, or planting a young one and going from there. Or basically, if you don't have either of those, then any other tree, native tree that's regionally appropriate would be, fine.
Sure. And there was a couple of questions about planting that they had already planted a non-soft landing tree. It was one was like a river bark birch, and it was should we remove them? Should we replace them? How to integrate them into our properties? I mean, yeah, how if they're not in that specific species list, are you that
Yeah,
concerned
well,
about them?
yeah, birch is actually on the list for Minnesota. I didn't have that in the slide, but it is one of our top 10. So because We've got the northern paper birch, we have the river birch that's native to the southeastern part of the state. It's more of a floodplain birch. So a birch is fine to have a soft landings planting under. You're still having a significant number of caterpillar species that are going to be feeding on that tree.
Perfect. So we don't have to wipe out everything we've already done.
No,
Good.
don't do that.
Good.
The whole point is not to undo what we're
Yeah.
doing, just to, yeah,
Progress, not perfection. Yes.
exactly.
Um, there was a couple of more tree things I wanted to maybe go before we go on to a different topic. Um,
Yeah, I'll just mention on the one of the links that Tara will provide, we have a number of recommendations on considerations when you do plant under a tree, as I mentioned, to protect that tree health and things to consider. So
Perfect.
one is you don't want to build up soil, like you don't want to do a raised bed as part of your soft landing planting, right? Because that's a heavy layer of material that you're putting on basically the tree root system or the lungs. And so you want to really think about this root system is the lungs, no heavy materials, no building up of soil. Otherwise, you're going to negatively impact the tree doing that.
Sure. So that kind of goes in with like a one of the questions is a culture where the raised bed with the wood underneath it. Would
Yes.
that be not a great soft
Yeah,
landing?
I wouldn't do that right on top of a large root system of a tree. So the hugelkultur I would do out more in a, open area under, not underneath the drip line of a tree.
Sure. And there was a lot of clarifying questions about how far from the tree should I plant these soft landings, how to take into effect, like, account the age of the tree, and all of those questions will be in those resources.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. So
Perfect.
like my 200-year-old oak, I wouldn't plant right up to the trunk because I've got these huge primary root systems coming out from that big tree, right? So in that scenario, you'd want to start further out from the tree, and then over time, the plants that are more rhizomatous or spreading are going to fill in that void naturally up to the trunk. But you don't want to start driving your spade into the major roots of a tree.
Sure. I think the trees have been stressed enough these last few years. They
Yes,
don't
they
need
have.
that manipulation to them. Yeah.
Right.
Um, So this is a great question that we haven't talked about for a few years. So some people say honeybees and native bees compete for food, so we shouldn't keep honeybees. Is there research to support this? If so, is this a major concern, or should we just concentrate on planting more plants, soft landings, etc.?
Yeah, there is a pretty large growing body of research that does seem to demonstrate that in certain situations, honeybees can compete for resources with native bees and can have negative impacts from disease transmission to from honeybees to native bees, and actually vice versa. So I think we need to be just more mindful of where it's appropriate to have a hive. So if we have thousands of hives within an urban area that can't support both native bees and honeybees, then maybe we need to be more mindful about um, what what I guess in agriculture we would call like a stocking rate, right? So whereas if you have 100-acre property and a significant number of flowering plants or acreage of flowering plants, then you can easily support a hive of honeybees as well as native bees. So it's very context specific. I believe the Bee Lab has a really nice statement on their website that you can check out about that topic, and also some recommendations. You can also look at the Xerxes Society. They have some great video and resources to help explain all of that research, what it means, and how it applies to certain situations.
This kind of goes along with it. How do bees know that the flower has been previously visited? I have heard that there's a kind of electric signal sent from the plant.
Yeah, yeah, there's a number of ways. It's so cool. So the flowers themselves can actually change color. So so if you envision a flower head or a raceme that has, multiple flowers and they sort of open from the bottom, make their way and open up to the top. Uh, those plants often, the parts of the flower will change color after a bee has visited. So it's a visual indicator for a bee approaching that flower stalk, flower raceme, to avoid the ones that are a different color and only visit the ones that haven't changed color. And just like you said, Tara, there are a number of sensory cues. So there's a sort of an electrical field that bees can sense. If a plant's been recently visited, it sort of dissipates that um, tension or potential between the bee and the flower, so the bee knows it's been recently visited. There are other ways that plants are sort of indicating visually, as well as through smell or their specific stage of flower development that will sort of guide bees on which kind of flowers they may visit, even from a single plant species. So yeah, that's really fun stuff to dive into.
That's crazy.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's nuts to think about.
yeah.
Um,
If only we could be a bee for a day to really truly understand how they live and orient and what their world looks like, right? Yeah,
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 just to look at bee vision. If you've never done that, that's really cool too. Of like, what
yeah,
do
yeah,
bees see?
yeah.
That's neat. What happens to bees that collect from specific plants when those plants aren't in season, since they bloom only for a few weeks?
Yeah, then they're they're out of luck, and that's what I was hinting at with some of the disadvantages for these pollen specialists. If they're, the real concern of this mismatch of the host plant when it blooms and when the bee is active and needing to collect those resources. So that's not going to bode well for some of these bees if they're, and then also just habitat fragmentation can significantly to reduce the quantity of flowering plants that they rely on, right? And making them fly longer distances just to get the food they need can be a real stressor as well.
It'd be like us running miles to go to the grocery store. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a pretty practical question. So there's been a couple of questions about using cardboard to prep the site. So how far in advance do you suggest prepping the site? And do you need to leave the thick paper on the site long before you covered with the bagged mulch? And then, or do you ever take off the paper?
Yeah, you can either leave it on or take it off. So I mentioned that I like to do it in fall by, putting leaf litter, then some paper or cardboard, then mulch. And then I leave that over the winter, and usually that period of time from fall until spring is enough to smother and kill the vegetation. So then in the spring you can just cut holes in the paper or cardboard and plant right into that rather than pulling it all up, right?
Less
So
work.
that's to me is the easiest way. And if your neighbors are thinking, what are they doing? They only need to look at a plain mulch bed for a month or so before we get into winter, and then it's ready to go in spring. So, and I think more people are anxious and ready to do gardening projects in spring than they are in fall. So having that bed all ready and all you have to do is put the plants in is the fun part.
I like it. And I think at least everyone on the call, our neighbors are probably used to us trying new things and,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
doing a little experiments. So I think, yeah,
Yeah.
just just
Oh, I
another one.
forgot to mention their Minnesota Native Landscapes, which is one of our native plant nurseries. They have developed this new mat that is probably 3/4 of an inch thick. So you just roll that out, and that is another smothering mechanism. My friend has done that. She has used a whole drill bit and drilled holes right through the thick mat, planted her plugs, left this smothering mat for a growing season, and then lifted it off after that. And that works quite well. It's a little bit more expensive, but it's also something you can actually reuse to smother other areas. So you can check that out. It's only available for sale in Minnesota, though.
And that would diminish the
Yes.
seeds coming
Yeah.
in.
Yeah.
That's maybe a question that we have. Do you need to burn the soft landing area periodically to reduce the weed seeds from growing?
I wouldn't say burning would to reduce weed seeds, but you do have to be mindful about building up too many years of leaf litter, especially if you're doing it under oak, because oak leaves don't decompose quickly. So I tend to pull off leaf litter every couple of years in parts of the planting, leaving some in others, because eventually too many leaves or too thick a leaf litter will start to smother and kill some of those plants. So there's always kind of a fine balance you have to, create between the less inputs to garden maintenance versus how much is too much of leaf litter. Yeah.
So the thick litter does make a difference. The smothering mats or the thick paper doesn't
The thick
suffocate
leaf
them.
litter, I was meaning like after your plantings planted, your that fall, multiple falls of leaf litter sitting in place on top of the soft landing planting. Yeah.
So not something that's temporary that you use to smother. Okay.
Right. Yeah. And so historically, of course, fire would have burned off that leaf litter periodically, right? So especially in oak ecosystems. So we wouldn't have had 10, 20 years of oak leaf litter build up in a planting or a natural situation. So that's why occasionally you need to check it and pull off some of that excess leaf litter.
Sure. We've had a lot of questions. So I think just about resources as well. So I'm wondering if one of the resources that you sent me would kind of cover this. It says, can you recommend a resource that shows which plants work together? Think in the sun, the soil, the water requirements. Also a resource that shows which resources, in particular, certain insect species across the seasons. So like which ones might pair up together.
Yeah, I think probably the easiest solution to that question would be just to visit any of the native plant nursery websites, like Prairie Moon Nursery. They all have the all of that information of insects that the plant may support, when it blooms, the soil conditions, the amount of light. So that at a glance, you're going to even in one of those catalogs or on their website, you'll get a good sense of what's blooming when and how can I create a planting that's going to ensure I have that continuous succession of flowering plants. So that would be my go-to.
Sure. I think I want to be mindful of time here. We don't want to take all of Heather's time, although I know a bunch of people were very appreciative that you joined us today. So I'll just do one more question, but don't worry if we didn't get to your question. We have resources to help you do your specific questions. So, which one should we do? I think actually the question that I had emailed you, Heather, before was what's something that you would like people to take away? And maybe that's kind of a final parting thought of what's some like one actionable item or maybe a few actionable items that you would like people to walk away and maybe in the spring, not right now, but to implement when they have time and when it makes sense.
Yeah, I think, well, just as I said with this whole concept is the actionable item is to think more in a sense of ecosystems, right? Versus just planting plants for a singular species. We want to be thinking about all of the different needs across an insect population and then how that really starts to build complex food webs. So that's why I think soft landings is a wonderful way to communicate to your friends and your neighbors, hey, I'm not crazy. I love gardening. And as an added bonus, this particular planting is doing all of these things. So it really just can be eye-opening for people, I think, to think beyond, some of these spaces and places that are just focusing on maybe one thing. So
Yeah, definitely. I think you're
yeah.
you're getting people excited too, and that's kind of what always happens with this at webinar. We get all excited and motivated, and then we're like, oh, we have to wait a few more months. But
Well, you can pre-order plants now, right? So you can start planning and lots of opportunities to get buy now and then have a wonderful delivery of plants in the spring. So
Like a delayed gratification.
yeah,
Perfect.
exactly.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much, Heather. If so, for everyone, if we didn't get to your questions today, you don't worry. So I'll be with the resource email. I'll send out how to contact your local extension office and your local extension educator for any follow-up or specific questions that you have. So I know we didn't get to a few of them. So Heather, thank you so much again for sharing your
Thank you.
knowledge
Yeah.
today and the work that you do to help people see that pollinator habitat is really, I mean, impactful and also achievable, that it's not just something that needs to be this perfect
Oh
idea
no.
thing. So
Don't
it,
let perfect be the enemy of the good, right?
yeah, yeah. So we really appreciate you being here today and being the keynote of our speaker or of our series. So um, I also want to thank the audience for all your great questions and, of course, being so engaged as I see all the different floaty emojis as always. So, yeah, this wraps up our first session of the 2026 Pollinator Webinar Series. And tomorrow we'll cover the topic, the latest buzz on bee research with Dr. Elaine Evans. And everyone have a great afternoon or wherever you're listening from. So we hope you to see you tomorrow. Thank you. Take care.